So, what's it gonna be? 5e or 5.5e? Or is it 5e24? Or 5e 10th Anniversary Edition? Is it even the same edition? And what else can we call the old 5e? 5e14? Hardline 5e? 5e Classic? Who knows? Let's discuss the edition of D&D we're currently playing. Hi there, I'm just a second level fighter who likes talking about Dungeons and Dragons, and if you choose to just tell people you play D&D instead of explaining the nuances of the current edition, then consider hitting the subscribe button or leaving a like on the video. But enough about that, because today we're setting the record straight, and taking a look at the 3 general approaches you can take when playing the 5th edition of this wonderful, confusing, and often frustrating game. So, it's no secret, but the 2024 Player's Handbook really complicated things when it dropped. Apparently, adding new shiny things to a game has some completely foreseen consequences when only some old rules and options are replaced, but others are left untouched and somewhat suspended in limbo. 5.5e is the most widely used way to refer to the updated edition, but let's not mince words here. It is still the same edition of D&D. 5th edition for 100 years, I guess. You may disagree, and that's okay. This whole situation could have been handled more clearly, but this is the reality we as D&D players are stuck with. Major updates and changes to any form of game are never what you might call smooth. Anyway, 5e is what launched D&D into the limelight, so to speak, and if it isn't so broken it doesn't work, then why bother making a new one? But all the older editions still exist. You may be an avid AD&D'er or a 3.5 purist, perhaps you even enjoy a bit of 4th edition, or maybe you jumped ship to something like Pathfinder a while ago. Regardless, we'll only be covering 5e today, even if playing other editions or games is a perfectly viable way to spend your time. Another thing, no matter what rules come out for the game, homebrewing and playing the way you want will always be a viable and cherished way to experience D&D. But always check with a group or DM as to what rules they're playing with, never assume it's just going to be what you're used to. With all that said and done, what are the 3 main ways we play 5e? And what do we cover here on this channel? Before we go any further though, a quick disclaimer. I get most of my 5.5e information on D&D Beyond, and when it comes to backwards compatibility, we'll see later on that there are some issues. I don't have a physical copy of the 2024 Player's Handbook or Dungeon Master's Guide, and I sincerely hope that the digital versions aren't missing some much needed clarifying info. So, if they are, I apologize and condemn whoever decided to omit sections regarding backwards compatibility. That would have been a really silly thing to do. But we'll get there when we talk about the third interpretation of 5e. One thing that is explicitly stated and objectively clear as day, the developers of D&D encourage the picking, choosing, and adding of game rules that work for you and your group. I obviously support the sentiment wholeheartedly and can't stress enough how important it is that we acknowledge that, although someone else made the rules, the game is ours to do with as we please. At least until we have another public war between WotC and the D&D community. Alright, let's start off with the simplest way to play 5e, or in this case, just 5.5e. I call this the Disney Star Wars approach because if you weren't aware, they nuked all established lore, stories, and properties from orbit in a brain-dead attempt at marketing new stuff. A bold strategy that might have paid off if the sequel trilogy and most of what came after didn't upset so many fans. Okay, with the Star Wars rant out of the way, this analogy isn't perfect, however you can play 5e by ignoring anything that was released prior to the 2024 Player's Handbook. As mentioned, this is the simplest way to play because everything is contained to the new core rulebooks and everything just kinda works. More than that, most of the player options share a better level of balance than before, at least to a certain degree. Balance in D&D is an illusion after all. This approach to the game does indeed lack some flavor as you are completely ignoring an enormous amount of great content that still holds up to this day. This includes a hell of a lot of spells, species, backgrounds, subclasses, magic items, adventures, monsters, and a lot more. However, if you've been playing 5e for the past 10 years, this might be a fresh take to draw you back into the game. It's also perfect for a brand new group just starting their journey in Dungeons & Dragons. For a few specifics, you're obviously only using the 2024 rules, not accounting for any homebrew you throw in to add some spice. Each class only gets 4 subclasses to choose from, and the options here are actually pretty varied and interesting if I'm honest. The artificer is not currently a thing though, which may be a make or break for some people. The list of spells presented in the PHB is comprehensive and pulls a few from older sourcebooks too. It's more than enough to cover most spellcasters' needs, but there are of course some issues. Conjure Minor Elementals being right at the top. Seriously, just homebrew nerf it or outright ban the spell. As for books, there's the PHB and DMG currently, and the Monster Manual will be coming out in February. Up until now, we've had to just use old monsters, which is fine. It's sounding like the new monster manual will change things up a bit, which should be awesome to dive into later. I just want to reiterate that the biggest draw here is how simple this type of approach to 5e is. From this point on, things get significantly more complicated from a choosing what books and options to allow standing point. If you want a smooth D&D experience and you're somewhat new to the hobby, consider limiting your games to 2024 content only. Moving on to the polar opposite, we have the antiquarian approach or the 5e purist approach. What even is a 2024 PHB? Dunno, never heard of such a thing. If you believe that 5e was perfectly serviceable before, then just keep on 5eing. This approach may sound simple, all you do is ignore the 2024 Player's Handbook and anything that came after. However, it's helpful to remember that 5e had some complications before the edition was updated. There are many books that came out with new minor updates and options, and you have to, as a group, pick and choose what is and isn't getting used. Everything pretty much works, but some of the books themselves introduce new systems or processes specific to players, and using all of them together gets muddy. Balance is also more of an issue. Very few attempts were made to rein in player characters and the obscene power certain builds carried. Lastly, 5e has its fair share of mechanical and even just vibey type problems. Take the base version of the Ranger, for example. The 2024 PHB and DMG addressed a few of these, at least to a degree. If you want to go in raw on the confusing language and the rampant abuse easily achievable by players, then 2014 rules only might just be for you. As for specifics, it's a bit tricky to cover here because of how wide and variable this approach is. You could go 2014 PHB, DMG, and Monster Manual only, which I do not recommend, but you could also include stuff like Xanathar's, Tasha's, and Mordenkainen's, the second one. Then there are all the setting-specific books too, like the Skag, Acquisitions Incorporated, Eberron, Ravnica, Theros, Wildmount, Van Richten's, Strixhaven, Spelljammer, and Planescape. And then of course the Dragon and Giant books, Fizbins, and Bigbees. And those are only the ones that include options for players. There are many more books containing adventures and other juicy stuff for DMs. Are we seeing a problem yet? The other issue is that 5e has already had a minor update in the form of Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. This added a bunch of variant rules and options for every single class to spice things up and improve on the already existing material. Could we call this 5 1/4 E? I don't know. However, no matter what parts of the absurdly wide array of content you choose to use, you will once again start seeing the cracks in the game. The difference between an optimized character and one thrown together with no regard for how the game is played is astronomical to say the least. Also, the game itself in an unaltered state was not designed to deal with the sweatiest and most broken player options. To deal with that, you need some level of DM intervention or creative problem solving, and no, I don't mean the true and proven classic option of rocks fall and everyone dies. 5e is an old edition with very different design sensibilities depending on which book you happen to open and flick through. But if it's what you've been playing for years already, why stop now? Okay, let's quickly cover the forbidden topic of backwards compatibility before we cover the best and worst way to approach 5e. Apologies if this comes off as ranty, but I don't understand why the developers of D&D decided not to devote an entire section of the 2024 PHB to backwards compatibility. Once again, I only have access to the digital versions, and while it does refer to using old species and backgrounds, it does not touch on subclasses at all, which is the biggest point of contention. And yes, I looked several times. I may be wrong, let me know if I am, please. I'm sorry, but addressing all of this in videos and interviews with community members just wasn't good enough. We really needed it in writing in the PHB and not in goddamn sidebars either. And once again, if such a section does exist, I extend my most humble apologies. But until we get an FAQ or errata that very plainly and clearly states out how the 2024 rules can be integrated with older content, I hope Crawford and the gang roll a few more natural ones than is statistically plausible. That being said, you can absolutely run older content with the new rules, but there are guaranteed to be complications. Let's take monks for example. Old monks had key points and every subclass was printed with that nomenclature. 2024 monks have focus points. If you don't make the very small logical leap and accept that key points are just focus points, well then many subclass features don't work because key points are just gone. Another example is the changing of certain features into sub-features like Pact of the Blade becoming an Eldritch Invocation. meaning that the improved Pact Weapon invocation from Xanathars no longer works because it requires the Pact of the Blade feature and not the Pact of the Blade invocation. And yes, I am a bit salty that I got that specific one wrong in my Hexblade video. Then there's the issue of certain classes getting access to their subclasses at level 1 or 2, and that not being a thing in the 2024 PHB. And those are just player option examples. Grappling is different too. Anything that gives advantage on checks to grapple a creature is now useless because grappling causes a saving throw. There are many more small and seemingly inconsequential differences that do eventually add up. However, if you can get past the small issues hiding around every corner, both versions are part of the same edition and 80% of the rules are close enough to just jam the square peg into the round hole and have it fit somehow. So, the mix and match approach, or the chaotic neutral throw everything at the wall and see what sticks approach. You obviously use the old player options and content with the new rules in whatever combination you choose. A general rule to follow is to not use anything that either shares the same name as an old option or feature, or was very clearly replaced with something new in the 2024 Player's Handbook. In other words, use the new classes, subclasses, feats, species, backgrounds, and spells, but feel free to use anything that wasn't touched. And yes, there are a few things from as far back as the 2014 Player's Handbook that fit this description, like the Martial Adept feat or the Necromancy Wizard subclass. However, you could also just ignore this and use the old version of things if you fancy returning to a world where Great Weapon Master and Sharpshooter added a flat 10 damage on hits for no good reason. As for balance, this is the approach where it is all but non-existent. Combining new and old options can lead to some very interesting but undeniably broken results. Certain subclasses shoot to new heights, and don't get me started on multiclassing. But that's what makes all this fascinating to me. There are some really stupid and not necessarily always broken things you can do when you mix and match. In my humble opinion, this is the full 5e experience. Keeping the old awesome stuff and getting to use the new shiny and chrome options and rules is a crazy, chaotic, and oddly fulfilling experience, and I highly recommend it, so long as you proceed with caution. How does it work though specifically? Well, with very little thanks to the creators of the game, we can intuit that you start with the 2024 rules as your baseline. Then, when and if an old option is requested for use, you need to take a look and see if it fits without requiring any adjustments. Surprisingly, this is actually the case for most player options. However, if the option just isn't going to work in a mechanical sense because of the nomenclature, like all monk subclasses with key point expending features, you can decide to handwave it and allow it to work as intended. But what if the specific rule just can't work and is too much of a stretch? Well, not allowing it is an option, allowing it in a broken and useless state is also an option, or straight up homebrewing it in a way to make it work as intended is a final option. Taking the improved Pact Weapon invocation from Xanathars as an example, just make it so that it requires the Pact of the Blade invocation instead of the feature. It's not going to break the game. But there are other examples that don't work like this at all, and this usually crops up when trying to use old versions of features or options that were specifically updated. This approach to 5e requires some level of effort to pull off effectively. My best advice is to try foresee the consequences of adding in something old before it becomes a problem at the table. Some things are just gonna break, and if you're not willing to homebrew it, there isn't much else you can do. But this is the most complicated and interesting way to play 5e, and there's some odd value in that. Now, what set of rules or approach do we cover here on this channel? Mix and match, obviously. It has the largest wealth of content and it piques my interest the most. However, this choice has led to more than a few errors and mistakes in my videos. All I can do is strive to improve and catch them. I will just say that I don't intend to assume a homebrew solution when something clearly doesn't work as was intended. I might point out that it's possible, but I try to also point out that it may result in a useless feature or option. Not everyone here on YouTube covers the old content in combination with the new, yet. I think after a certain point that might change. 5.5e on its own is very limited when compared to everything that came before, at least from a player option perspective. Also, I've played around in a few games with some mixed and matched rules and it didn't cause too many issues. Once again, it is something that needs to be approached with caution. As we'll see in the upcoming Chronology Wizard video, bad things happen when you let your players take whatever options they like without checking in first. Alright, that was a somewhat thought out breakdown of how to approach 5e. I've got to ask, what rules do you play with? I see value in all of them, and no matter what choices you make, any of these three approaches can absolutely make for great D&D. Anyway, if you've made it this far into the video, then you're a legend, and I really do appreciate you. Do you foresee any issues with specific subclasses or options being shoved in with the 2024 rules? If so, what are they? I'm curious. It isn't really an issue, but I think that taking the Elven Accuracy feat and putting it on a champion fighter with a Vex weapon is somewhat interesting. But yeah, that'll do it for this one. Cheers.